Another aspect of practice in the 4th century developing are the developments with respect to church buildings. We mentioned how in the 3rd century you had places like Dura Europos. So you start to see some of those church buildings, right? Building structures explicitly either constructed or remodeled for the church to meet. It appears, though, that a lot of those would have been destroyed during the reign of Diocletian, at least in the places that were more heavily populated. And so towards the end of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th century, a lot of Christians appear to have gone back to the house church model. And so it's not like this sudden explosion in the 3rd century. There's kind of a beginning, and then it's kind of cut off.
We're not talking about monasticism.
No, we're talking about in society, in the cities, those places. But after the Peace of Constantine, people start flocking to churches, right? Because the emperor is supportive of this group, and so more and more people, well, you need more spaces to contain them. Right? And so church buildings start appearing again. And certainly, as you might expect, in the imperial centers, places where there was a lot of power, cities that were very important in the empire, those church buildings often became very grandiose, very luxurious in their style and the decoration. There were essentially 2 styles of church buildings that developed during the 4th century. The first was the basilica. Here's a general floor plan of what a basilica would have looked like. Basilicas were common public buildings in Roman culture, and so these church buildings are just modeled after buildings that already existed. Most of those tended to be basic rectangular structures that were split into 3 sections, right? And places for that, right? Excuse me. 1, 2, 3, right? In them, also, to support the weight of the ceiling, were a lot of parallel columns, which is what's represented here, right? So you're supporting the weight, which adds to the division of the space. The other end, this end, there was a little cutout, or niche, or apse, A-P-S-E, in the wall, kind of marking the opposite end of the entrance. Often the roofs would be tiered, and there would be windows on the upper levels to allow light to come in. This would be kind of the lobby area. This section is referred to as the nave, and then the aisles is what's represented here as well. The other style of church building was known as the convergent martyrium. It was more of I couldn't find a diagram of these, so that's why we don't have one of that. But it was more of a circular or octagonal building. Right? So instead of the rectangular long stretch, you had more of a circular type of thing. Often they included domes instead of the tiered roofs. Usually a lot of things took place in the center of the building with an aisle around the walls. They too would have columns in it to hold the roofs. What we also begin to see is that as these buildings are constructed as church buildings, some of them were constructed to face the east, specifically constructed to face the east. And prayers would often be offered in that direction. Why the east?
Sunrise.
All right, sunrise. If you're in Rome, towards Jerusalem would be to face east. Right? Even though we might say, well, it's not important which direction you pray. Right? This is how some people were thinking. There were some that faced west as well. You also see the development of a table that is specifically the communion table. If you were meeting in homes, probably things would have been set on the table, but it's the table you eat off of the rest of the week. But now there is the communion table, sometimes referred to as an altar. Many of those started as wood, but as history goes on, they eventually moved to stone. The table would often, especially in basilicas, be located in the center or in that niche area, the apse area, toward the front. In these church buildings, there were relatively few chairs. There were chairs in the apse where the bishop sat. There were benches for the presbyters. Everybody else had to stand. Oh, and these aren't short services. All right, it's not 15 minutes. Right, you might be standing for an hour, 2 hours, and so a lot of standing in early Christianity. Sometimes church buildings also began to incorporate other structures as well, houses for the clergy, right, the bishop or a priest, or they might include a hostel, kind of a place for people that are traveling, Christians who are traveling to stay and have some protection. There might be baths or baptistries connected there as well. Sometimes, especially by the end of the 4th century, right, when Christianity is the official religion in the empire and there is this attempt to eliminate paganism, Christians would take pagan temples and convert them to church buildings, sometimes with very little modification. And so you see that additional development as well. Very important within the church building was the development of the liturgy. Liturgy refers to the style and pattern of worship. What is done, when it is done, how it is done. Now, liturgy would probably be a term that's familiar to certain people from certain traditions, but churches of Christ don't have a liturgy, right?
Gotta go to this. 2 songs of prayer, 3 songs, sermon, a song, the Lord's Supper, and a song.
Right? So liturgy is a little bit more formalized than that, right? There is that kind of, churches tend to fall into, we do things this way, right? In the prayer language, while there's a difference, there's some of those phrases that incorporate themselves into prayer. What we're talking about, however, is much more formal and much stricter than some of the things that we're talking about. Still, not as strict as what it would come in the Middle Ages, where it's specifically prescribed, right? This is the prayer you offer, and this is the song you sing, and these are the things that are done after that. But even by the 4th century, you begin to see some of that. Essentially, the first 3 centuries, the liturgy was largely informal. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about Justin. There would be 2 parts to the service. There would be the service of the Word, which would involve teaching or reading of Scripture, and then the service of the Eucharist, which was only for baptized Christians. And so if you were a catechumen, if you were not baptized, you left at that point. But by the 4th century, there's much more of a formalized structure. Right? That included prayers, singing of psalms, verse-by-verse exposition of Scripture. And gradually, based on the people that are coming in, and based on a Christian leadership that is looking to counter paganism and pagan philosophy, you see much more of an emphasis on the rhetoric of sermons, right? That there should be a style, there should be, that you can't just sit there and talk. It's got to be something that's rhetorically, logically put together in certain ways. There would be singing and praying, and then the second part would be the Eucharist. And even the Eucharist, the service of the Eucharist became much more elaborate. In fact, by the later 4th century, daily Eucharist was available. So you could go to the church on any day of the week and participate in the Eucharist. Furthermore, with all the controversies that we see going around, there's that pressure for uniformity in doctrine, but there becomes to be that pressure in uniformity of practice as well, right? So that all the churches are doing the same things in the same ways. There are several attempts at that uniformity in the 4th century of people trying to present how it should be done. There's a work called the Apostolic Traditions that attempts to say this is the way the service should be done, but even Basil, Chrysostom, who we'll talk about later, Ambrose of Milan, will all write down an attempt to say this is how it should go. Including specific prayers to be offered, scriptural references, songs, ultimately being taken as these are to be said exactly, these are to be prayed exactly. Often as these worship spaces became much more elaborate, art became much more a part of the practice of Christianity as well. You still see the presence of catacomb art as people went down to those realms of the dead and painted scenes. You also begin to see interesting aspect of art appearing on coffins or sarcophagi. One from that time that's a rather detailed piece is the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, who was a Roman prefect who became a Christian. Actually, shortly before his death, when Constantius II was ruler. There it is. So I can tell you what all these are. Some of them you might be able to pick up, but it's a very intricate scene. I mean, if you can see it, what's this depicting? Adam and Eve in the garden. All right. How about this one? This is the arrest of Peter. All right. So some of them can jump out, and then others don't as much. Zacchaeus. Up in the tree.
Are they supposed to be sort of like in order of importance or anything?
It doesn't appear, because this one is the sacrifice of Isaac, but then you have the arrest of Peter, and then now here's Adam and Eve.
What about the one with the headless man on the left? David.
That is actually Jesus' trial before Pilate, and part of the head has been broken off. All right, so it wasn't intentionally a headless man. You might not be able to make it out, but there's kind of a little cup or a bowl for Pilate to wash his hands.
Okay. Is that Daniel on the line?
Yep, Daniel on the lion's den. There's one of them right here. Daniel on the lion's den.
It's all right.
Jesus enthroned with Peter and Paul on either side of him. What do you know about Jesus?
One beard.
Still one beard. Right? So we've gone 4 centuries and people still not putting the beard on Jesus. They were heretics back then. This isn't Zacchaeus. It's Jesus entering Jerusalem. Sorry, I saw him in the tree and I thought it was Zacchaeus. This is Paul being arrested, being led to his execution. This is actually a plaster cast of the actual sarcophagus, and not the actual sarcophagus itself. But you can see it's really kind of elaborate compared to some of the artwork that we saw in the 3rd century, with some of that symbolism. But this idea of I'm getting ready for death, I want these stories on my coffin. You also begin to see, by the 4th century, more prominently artwork in churches. We could see some, art in the Jerry Ropus picture, but mostly it wasn't like pictures of things. It was just more like that design you would find at home. But you start seeing things like golden crosses, candlesticks, mosaics. These are the things that start appearing in churches. And then finally, people might have had Christian art in their homes prior to the 4th century, but what's been discovered seems to be more from the 4th century. As you would think, as it gets, you have to have the funds to commission a piece, let alone to buy it. And most of the artwork in Christian homes were the symbols, right? Fish, cross, other things like that, or like what you had on Junius Bassus' sarcophagus, right? Pictures of stories. They would be on wall panels, vases, or vases, depending where you're from, and lamps.